Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of the State of Affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. 237. That's the number of days that the Israeli hostages have been held and abused in the Gaza Strip by Hamas. Every day that passes brings with it new horrors and fears of the remaining hostages and their fate. Will they come home, and is Israel and the rest of the world doing enough to get them back? Is the topic of today's podcast. When the video of the Tatzpitaniyot, the female soldiers from Nachal Oz, was released last week, there did seem for a brief moment that the fight for a deal was coming back to the public as its top priority. As we will soon hear from some of our guests today, not everyone thinks so. Israel appears, though, to at least be going through the motions. It has reportedly given the Qatari, Egyptian, and American mediators a new proposal for a deal, and the ball will now move back to the Hamas side of the court. Will it agree to a deal? Does the operation in Rafah even put pressure on Sinwar and Death? Honestly, no one really knows. What we do know is that our people need to come home. Victory or not in Gaza, that has to be the goal. Well, at least that's my opinion, for what it's worth. Today, we're going to talk to three people. My first guest is Roger Zakheim. Roger is director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, a former general counsel for the House Armed Services Committee, and a member of the National Defense Strategy Commission. I saw Roger 3 weeks ago when he was in Israel as part of a group brought here by AIPAC, of foreign policy experts, who toured the country to learn about the war in a post-October 7th reality. When Roger got back to D.C., he wrote a powerful op-ed in the Washington Post, calling on President Biden to do much more to get the hostages home. And we're going to put a link for that in the text. I then speak with two of my JPPI colleagues, Dr. Nurit Cohen and Noah Slepkov. We look at the politics in Israel and why Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to not be making the hostages and their return his top priority. Here we go. So, Roger, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted to start with your op-ed in the Washington Post, which runs with the headline, "Enough mediating, America should deploy its might against Hamas." Tell me what happened on your visit here that brought you to write this op-ed that basically said, hey, President, get your act together, start working.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Yaakov. And I think the trip, it was great to see you in Israel, crystallized this idea or this shift that I've been contemplating for some time. And really it comes down to what should be the lens through which the United States, and specifically the President of the United States, looks at the war in Gaza, looks at Hamas, and organizes U.S. policy. And to me, the lens should really begin with the Americans held hostage by Hamas. And as you know, and as I'm sure your listeners know, the attack on October 7th was not only an attack on Israel and Israeli citizens, but it also extended to an attack on Americans. Over 40 Americans killed, and of course, the American hostages. And in my mind, the administration approach, I mean, your introduction referenced kind of how Prime Minister Netanyahu may or may not be prioritizing the hostages. I kind of apply the same thinking against President Biden. And in my mind, the United States, as you reference, approaches it as a mediator, as you have these two parties and they're coming in as a great power and trying to resolve the differences. But in my mind, the United States is a victim here, and we should not be treating, that is, the United States should not be treating Hamas as some state-like entity, and that there are a lot of other tools in America's toolkit in which they could apply pressure on Hamas to see specifically the U.S. citizens that are held hostage in Gaza be released.
So you named in the op-ed a couple of tools that they could potentially unleash. Some of it has to do with sanctions and being a little more aggressive with designating some sanctions against using the Treasury against Hamas officials. You mentioned, I think you wrote about unleashing intelligence and military capabilities similar to those that were used in the hunt for bin Laden and others across America's array of enemies over the years. Give us a little more detail what you would like to see happen.
Well, listen, the sanctions piece really stands out. I mean, one of the difficult things to understand about the Biden administration is how nothing since October 7th seems to have changed their Iran policy. And we know that Iran has been a key supporter of Hamas that has had a material impact on Hamas's ability to operate. And so, whether or not there was command and control, in designing the operation on October 7th, I mean, we'll see about that. There are different views on it, but it's kind of indisputable that Iran has really been a key driver in support of Hamas, and so that needs to be addressed, and that pressure needs to be applied. Similarly, I think and that could be done via sanctions. I mentioned, banking sanctions in particular. I mean, they haven't ratcheted up the pressure. Kind of inexplicably, we now have reports that the Europeans want to apply pressure on Iran, and the administration seems to be holding back. But that also would extend to Qatar, to Egypt, in my mind. And then I think the part that got perhaps is most controversial, but in my mind is kind of basic to why the United States has a military and how it should be used, and why it invests so significantly in an intelligence apparatus, is that we, in my mind, have not applied those tools. That is the counterterrorism tools, as you just referenced, and the robust intelligence tools of the United States, and focused it on the issue of the hostages, specifically U.S. hostages. And Yaakov, there's no doubt there's been intelligence sharing. There's been public reporting of some U.S. military assets on the ground, but and as I referenced in the piece, in a purely advisory capacity, as if they're kind of whispering, information. But it's full on in support, and how robust that support is, I think, is questionable. My mind is that we need to be leading on this, and perhaps it was defensible, Yaakov, first week, first months of the conflict, but here we are, as you referenced, 237 days since the hostages have been held. Israel, is burdened in a lot of different ways with this war. It could use an infusion of U.S. support, tactical support, and you talk to folks on the ground, and if we had Delta, the special operations forces there, that would make a material impact. Should there be good intel in terms of carrying out an operation. Last point on it, there was kind of a curious piece of information that filtered out right around the time we were in Israel together, and in the days after, that somehow the United States, would provide more intelligence to the IDF if the IDF chose not to go into Rafah. Of course, events have made clear that either that intelligence was being shared or was not, but Israel was going in anyway. But it did reinforce this point that somehow the Biden administration is not doing all it could to support the release of hostages, specifically U.S. hostages. Yaakov, Americans all know what 444 days refers to. They know that was the number of days we had hostages held in the embassy, U.S. embassy in Tehran. There is not nearly enough understanding in the United States of not just the hostages at large, but that we have the largest number of Americans being held hostage since those hostages were held in Tehran in 1979, 1980.
And then, that took a long time, but America was ultimately able to release them. And in your criticism, I think, is also the fact that the president or the American public is not looking at it as if this is their issue, right? And that's what you're basically asking for. I'm curious, Roger, just tapping in also to kind of your national defense background and the time you spent on the House Armed Services Committee. I feel like in conversations I've been having with a lot of Americans from within the defense community, they were obviously very surprised by what happened on October 7th and the ease of which the Hamas attackers were able to enter and infiltrate into Israel, dozens of different infiltration points along what was supposed to be one of the more sophisticated border barriers that existed in the world. And I keep on thinking back to 2006, the Second Lebanon War, where it was no secret that after that war, and Israel running into hardship and trying to defeat Hezbollah without a clear victory in the aftermath led to a kind of, I don't want to call it a shattering, but some question marks and raising of eyebrows. What happened in the mighty IDF? And I'm hearing some voices like that today also within the U.S. Defense community. What do you make of that situation?
I think that's the right analogy, Yaakov. I think U.S. policymakers are absorbing what I think people in the region have absorbed, which is there was a heavy amount of hubris within the IDF and kind of the Israel security establishment combined with an over-reliance on technology, combined with a poorly designed strategy, right? Which of course was, we're going to focus on Iran and the nuclear program. We're going to kind of have a weakened Hamas and a weakened Palestinian Authority, and really almost look past those security issues. So the combination of hubris in terms of what the IDF could do, and over-reliance on technology, as I mentioned, the kind of flawed strategy, has made a lot of people, second guess to what extent Israel's able to take care of its own business. I mean, the mindset, Yaakov, and I wonder if this resonates with you, given your expertise in the U.S.-Israel security relationship, had been that almost the United States could outsource its need for intelligence and kind of investment in kind of understanding and working in the region to its ally Israel, because they kind of had it taken care of. And I think the one of the big implications for the United States, perhaps it's not a top 5 implication for Israel after October 7th, but for the United States, is that you really can't outsource that to Israel anymore. Like, we really can't kind of defer to them on what exactly is happening in Gaza, what exactly is happening on the border with Lebanon, that there needs to be this somewhat, the U.S. needs to have its own independent look. I think probably leading into, 2024, the mindset was, no, our partners kind of got this covered, which really was something that we wanted, that is, the United States wanted, because we were looking to focus, and our strategy calls for this, on the Indo-Pacific. And one of the main ways we could accomplish that would be
it's covered by someone else.
Yeah, cover partners and allies, would cover us in the CENTCOM region and in the Middle East. I was always skeptical of that. I never really thought we should outsource security to Israel and Saudi Arabia. That to me didn't seem like a recipe for stability, meaning they would be necessary kind of variables in a U.S.-led security framework, but not something that we could just kind of offload to them. That, I think, is all being revisited.
So in the aftermath of October 7th, and we saw this huge military buildup at some point during the beginning of the war, the Eisenhower, the Ford, the aircraft carrier, the strike groups that were sent here, some squadrons that President Biden did dispatch to the region. My criticism mostly was that America and Israel, for the most part, continued and have been continuing to give the Iranians immunity throughout the last 7 months, despite attacks against Israel, of course, via proxies, but also against U.S. positions and forces, soldiers killed in Jordan by Iranian-led militias. The question is, though, Roger, do you feel, and I know that you guys are in an election season, so everything is kind of very fluid, but is it possible that October 7th, based on what you were just saying, could actually lead to more American involvement in the region as opposed to less? Obviously it would depend on who wins in the election, but is that even something that's in the cards? Or does everyone just want to not be involved here anymore?
Great question. Policymakers, Republicans and Democrats, speaks out of both sides of their mouth on this issue. So kind of black letter strategy says we want to do less in the region. We want to focus on the Indo-Pacific, as I referenced a moment ago. And by the way, it's not just the Middle East, it's Europe as well. We have a kind of a manifestation of this as we think about the war in Ukraine. But the reality is quite different, and people, kind of the point of view that I've adopted, and you see this in pockets of the Republican Party and Democratic Party, is that you can wish away the Middle East for the United States, but you do so at your own peril. And the absence of a persistent presence, militarily, intelligence, diplomatically, it's going to bring you back in and cost you more. And that's effectively what we're feeling with October 7th, but not specifically with Hamas's attack on Israel, but really when it comes to the Houthis, right? That's the best example of this, as well as where you've seen the flare-ups in Syria and Iraq too, right? They are going to come after you unless you continue to mow the grass. And one of the things that I've been critical of the Biden administration on is they have deployed all of these military assets, as you referenced a moment ago, but have only done it in this defensive crouch, this posture of missile defense. But they have not effectively taken out the targets. And what does that mean to take out the targets? That means tactically going in and really putting the pressure on the Houthis, right? Which they've only done at a minimal amount, which is why we've seen such a kind of a costly impact on trade in the Red Sea. Similarly, on the militia groups in Syria and Iraq. Now there, it took, kind of over 100 attacks on U.S. deployed forces for them to finally restore some deterrence by attacking the target. But this notion that the United States is going to somehow deal with the threats in the Middle East through, applying our own form of Iron Dome, which, as you know, is a lot more costly than Israel's, systems, is one that is really puts us at a disadvantage. Ultimately, what was required, and you just hit on this, in a moment ago, was we got to put pressure on Iran. And unless you're putting pressure on Iran, the militias are going to continue to be empowered to attack American targets. Well, last point, Yaakov, because it goes back to kind of where we started in the conversation. We have boots on the ground. As the United States has boots on the ground in Syria. The United States has boots on the ground in Iraq, right? One of those focus areas in Syria is not only to the counterterrorism mission, but actually to protect oil fields there. Okay? So the notion that we can put boots on the ground in Syria and Iraq to take care of what is otherwise an economic interest, but we can't put boots on the ground to protect, and I forget about protect, to rescue U.S. citizens who are held hostage by Hamas is inexplicable to me. You say let's put a small pocket of U.S. special forces in Gaza or in Israel to be able to operate in Gaza should the intelligence yield an opportunity. And people say, no, we're not going to put boots on the ground. Yaakov, take a look. About a week ago today, from the time we're recording, the spokesperson for the Department of Defense was asked about this. And she said, President Biden stands by his policy of no boots on the ground in Gaza, even to address the hostage situation. But we'll do everything we can in our power, short of that, to get the hostages out. She did not make a distinction between U.S. hostages and the rest of the hostages. To me, it makes no sense. You don't put that presence in place, and you're familiar with this from kind of military operations. If you're not there, it has a qualitative difference in your ability to address the situation.
Is it because, Roger, I'll let you go, but is it because that these people who were taken were also Israeli? Do you think that it's because it's Israel?
I hope not. I really do, Yaakov. I hope there aren't two classes of U.S. passport holders, the ones that are U.S. citizens and the ones that are dual citizens. As a matter of law, as a matter of policy, there is no distinction. But this no boots on the ground policy, which again was reinforced just a week ago by the spokesperson of the Department of Defense, makes no sense to me. Let me take those forces on the ground in Syria, put them in Israel on the border with Gaza, and let's get these hostages out. That, unfortunately, has been nowhere in the policy conversations in Washington, D.C., in the White House. It's it's kind of a tried and true way to kill a conversation. If you say we're not putting boots on the ground, then you just get the politicians given the head nod and people move on in the conversation. It's a mistake and needs to be corrected.
Well, Roger, I want to thank you very much. And really, to our listeners, please click on this op-ed. You're going to want to read it because it really, it hits you because it just makes sense. Right? And it's just something that you say, someone's right. It's like sometimes there are op-eds that you read and you're like, yeah, he's got it. So Roger, Zakheim, thank you so much for joining us here at JPPI and appreciate your time.
Well, thanks, Yaakov. Thanks for everything you do, and let's bring them home.
Amen. So Nurit, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Nurit, I thought I'd start with you. I mean, obviously the hostages is a very tough issue. I was thinking about how just the other day I happened to be in Tel Aviv and was at a meeting and wanted to cross over to Sarona to meet someone else. I was by the Beit Mishpat, by the courthouse. And I walk through this parking lot, go up these stairs and find myself in Hostage Square. Like I didn't even realize that's where I'm going. And it just hits you straight in the face or in the gut, however you want to look at it, because it's so still very real and it doesn't seem like there's a solution. And we're seeing increased protests on the streets. People are getting more and more frustrated and disappointed with the government. What's your take on everything that's going on?
Well, in a way, I'm happy to hear you say that you feel that the protest is increasing and you see evidence of the of this problem as you walk by in the streets of Israel. But my feeling is that in many ways, the protest is really not taking off, and it is very surprising and very disappointing and very depressing for me to see the really not that large of numbers of protesters involving and engaging in this protest. That I can't think of any other protest that should have brought more Israelis together, more.
So why is it then, in your opinion, then if you're, because I don't know, maybe in Jerusalem, we did see this past Saturday night an increased and more people, a little more aggressive. There was aggressive by the police as well. But put that aside, if your feeling is that there's not, why do you think that there's not then?
Well, first of all, I believe that many of us had mixed feelings about it at the beginning of the war, where many of us hesitated to protest during war. This is something Israelis are not used to do. We are used to be, or at least also feel and also project outside that we are united in our mission.
Right.
And while the
to be loyal to the country at a time of war.
Yeah. So, but that's an excuse for the beginning of the war. The question is, why is it not taking off right now? And I agree that after the release of the last footage of the women soldiers, women teenagers, actually, last week, there is an increased rage, and maybe the numbers also got up a little bit, but it is still, I feel that many of us are so disappointed, so deeply, I mean, before the war, we had a protest that lasted more than a year against
judicial reform,
or you can call it in other names. And the feeling that was that we managed to stop or slow down some of this dangerous process, but it really didn't had a major success and a conclusive victory, if you want.
So you think that might have gotten people to believe that the protests won't be as successful?
Yeah.
Noah, JPPI, and you were involved in this. We did a poll back in February, so it's a couple months away. But it was asked, people were asked, what do you prefer if you have a choice between ousting Hamas and returning the hostages? I have to say, I was quite surprised by that poll, because 47% of Israeli Jews said that they prefer ousting Hamas, and 25% at the time said that they want to get back the hostages. And even in a more, in more recent polls, there still is this feeling, I think, that people believe that there still is this opportunity to emerge somehow victorious in this war with Hamas, which I'm not even sure what that means these days, what victory means. The only definition I come up for victory is getting our people home. But, when I say that, people say, oh, you're a defeatist. So I'm not sure. But how do you view this kind of the way Israeli society is split on this issue?
Look, I'll tell you, recent polling, we asked Israelis what would signify the end of the war. When we gave a bunch of options. When the residents of the South and the North return to their homes, when a non-Hamas government is established in Gaza, when the government announces that the war is over, and one of the options is when the hostages return. And only 13% of Israeli Jews said that the war will be over when the hostages return. So there's a clear priority among Israelis when given the choice between, going back to normal, meaning people return to their homes in the North and the South, and returning the hostages, they say returning to the North, to the people in their homes.
That would be the sign of war, right?
Right, that the war would be over. And I think the fundamental problem we have as Israelis is that if we decided now to capitulate to Hamas's demands of basically ending the war, leaving Hamas in power in Gaza, and returning the hostages or whatever is left, the bodies of the hostages, back to Israel. This deal would basically be a major defeat for Israel, that Hamas went in and they did a terrible massacre. And in the end, in exchange for us getting the hostages back, we let Hamas stay in power. This really would be for many Israelis a capitulation. Now, of course, people would say, well, that's fine, because as soon as we get the hostages back, we can go and defeat Hamas, which is implied in a lot of the rhetoric. I'm sure if you ask people, if would you agree to ending the war if we get all the hostages back, they would say yes, but their assumption is, of course, well, we'll get them back at another time. We'll be able to, eventually defeat Hamas. But just such an agreement, leaving the Gaza Strip, just a full, total withdrawal from Gaza, and giving Hamas back the Gaza Strip to rearm and continue its struggle to destroy Israel, would be a defeat. So, and this is kind of the brilliance, if you don't mind me saying that, about what Hamas did. The assumption is, well, they miscalculated how we would how Israel react, or they were too successful in their operation on October 7th. But if you look at what's happened, they were patient. They're not worried about the destruction of Gaza as much as the rest of the world is. I mean, if the last man standing in Gaza and they win, that's for them a total victory, in my opinion. So if you look at the situation now, we don't have the hostages back. The world is completely against us, or it would seem that way. Our relationship that was on this great high with the United States is that high is low. That high is over, to say the least. A great low. Although, to be fair, the Americans are at the end of the day, they have our back, and they're not completely putting up the red tape around us. But clearly, Hamas is in a far better position today than they were.
What they did was definitely, I agree with you, was definitely brilliant. But there's something that I think I find very interesting when it comes to support or lack of support for hostages and for the deal, is to some extent also how it falls along political lines. Like, I actually had a meeting a couple months ago, happened to meet with a big advertising agency in Israel, that they were very involved in what's known as the Mateh Hatufim, like the hostage headquarters. And they were very involved in putting on, the strategy behind it and all the different events behind it. And I was sitting in the room, and I was the only guy who was wearing a kippah. So I said, even though I never view myself as the representative of the migzar, as it's called in Hebrew, of the sector, of the national religious sector, because I don't think they would want me to be the representative. But, and I wouldn't either, but I said, you have to ask yourself a serious question. Like, how is it that there was a poll that was taken earlier on in the war, and back in January, 15% of that team of national religious people believe in prioritizing a return of the hostages. And it was much different than the rest of Israeli society. And you also, you hear this complaint throughout the last 7 months of how the fact that there aren't a lot of religious people at the protest. There are not a lot of religious people who are speaking up on behalf of the hostages. It's just whether it's true or not, it definitely feels like it's the assumption. And this goes back to some extent, I think, Nurit, to what you were talking about before. You were talking about how people felt that the judicial reform protest didn't succeed, so maybe that kind of took the air out of the feeling of protesting. But I wonder something else, if there are people who feel that the protest of the hostages is actually a protest against Netanyahu, right, and is very political, and therefore when they see that, they say, oh, no, that's a left-wing issue, I'm not aligned with that, and it shouldn't be a left-wing issue, but it has to somewhat become a left-wing issue.
The fact that it had become a political issue is, in my view, one of the points where Hamas beat us. I mean, if we can't unite around this issue, then what's left of the state of Israel? I mean, for the numbers that Noach shared with us are really shocking to me, because one of the longest secrets of Israel's security along the years was our solidarity. The fact that we were able to put aside political differences and disagreements and unite in times of trouble. And of course, and without a question, we unite whenever and wherever an Israeli, one Israeli or more were in trouble, whether abroad and whether across enemy lines, etc. So if we forget the old saying, Kol Israel arevim ze leze.
That all Israelis are responsible for one another. All Jews are
for one
responsible.
another.
Yeah.
And the mitzvat pidyon shvuim, which is so high in Jewish tradition and religion. And if we forget these fundamental beliefs and issues and the rings that really held us together, then I really can't. This for itself is disappointing and despairing, and a sign of our growing weakness as a society and as a state.
But
I think, can I?
Yeah, please.
Look, I think Netanyahu had a choice at the start of this to make this war a war for all of Israel or for his political benefit. And I think very, very early on, he saw this as a way to strengthen his political situation in Israel. And he didn't say, as our colleague Gil Troy had suggested several times on this podcast, that Netanyahu should come out and just say, I am not going to seek re-election. I'm going to win the war and I'm going to leave politics. If he had said that, then all the decisions he can say, I'm making this decision for the right reasons and not for political reasons. But because most of the way he's conducted this war are for political considerations, and people who are familiar with the the people in charge of the hostage negotiations are talking about that the Netanyahu is playing politics on every decision when the army
alone, the chief negotiator basically for Israel, the head of the IDF office that's working on the hostages, said apparently this week, was quoted in the media as saying that this government will never make a hostage deal. This government's incapable of making a hostage.
Right. So of course this is a political issue, because this is by design, that it's this slogan of, together, united, we will be victorious. That's everywhere.
Noah, I don't know. Tell me what you think about this, but obviously the hostages, they're victims of a crazy horror that's unimaginable, but they also are the symbol of the failure of October 7th, right? And you never saw, I think it was until, I could be wrong, I haven't been counting everything, but until Pesach Seder night, so the night of the Passover Seder, was the first time, I think, maybe one of the only times throughout the war, and I could be wrong again, that you saw Netanyahu standing with a picture of hostages. Right? Here is a man who knows how to travel the world with cartoon bombs of the nuclear, program of Iran, standing at the UN, uses oratory skills to advance issues and, slam his fist on the table to get people to do what he thinks is right. Has he taken ownership? He's avoided ownership of the hostage because of the political price that you're talking about.
Right. I mean, I would even go further than that. If you look at Channel 14, which is the Fox News, or even like One Nation Newsmax of Israel, they had a story this week that if you look at the people who were hostages, that they're mostly left wing, and if they're being right wing can save lives. Like, did you see this story? It was covered
people who were killed, I think, throughout the war. Yeah, in the border area. What your political leanings mean for your survival. Disgusting.
Right. So these types, I mean, look, you had a podcast recently with Shlomo Fisher, our colleague, and you asked him what polarization is, and he said when people, they can't talk about issues at the dinner table because it's going to end up in a fight. I mean, look how polarized vaccines for COVID got, right? Like in the United States, if you were pro-vaccine, you were Democrat, or if you were pro-mask, you were Democrat, and if you were against the masks, you were Republican. And it just somehow turned into this political situation about who would wear a mask. So
and some things, Nurit, should be above politics, and sadly they're not. Is there any hope for us here? Obviously the government is going to hopefully make the way to get back the hostages, and this, I keep on saying, is this dream of some Entebbe style operation probably not going to happen. We have to make a deal if we want to get back our people, and we need to get back our people. And that's that's got to be the basic. Is there hope that this can be done, that Israelis can come together, can have that solidarity like you spoke about?
Well, I for myself can't afford to lose hope on that. And referring to what you said before, let us all remember that it took the Prime Minister several days to include the release of the hostages in the list of the goals of the war. And that is something that happened, 10 days or 2 weeks after the October 7th. And that was the first sign that something went terribly wrong in our priorities and our policy. And I have to repeat and say that if we lose this basic solidarity and this old policy that we had along the years, then we have really a danger to our existence. Because if we are not committed to bring those people back, then every one of us, each and every one of us will ask himself, well, what if next time it's going to be me? The streets are going to be empty. The parliament will turn against me. The Israeli parliament members of parliaments will turn against me. The Israeli government won't do anything everything in its power to bring me back. Then, I'm going to volunteer to the army. Young man or a young girl will ask himself, why should I do that? Why should I do that? The risks are really high. And I have to be 100% sure that the way I used to think about those issues and the way the state of Israel looked upon those issues is the same. And if that is going to change, then the basic contract between the state and its civilians, its youngsters, is going to be cancelled. And that this is really a danger that all of us have to worry about.
Yeah. It's tough times and it's depressing. And I totally agree with you that, we have to imagine that it's someone we know, or it's our child, and it's hard not to, right? I mean, when you watch that video of the Tatzpitaniot, of the girls, the female soldiers who were taken hostage. Personally, I have a daughter who's around the same age in the army right now, serving as an officer. I mean, it could have been anyone, right? I mean, it was the luck of these people, the bad luck that they were there and it was them, but it really could be anyone. And that's the only way that and for that reason, we really have to do everything possible.
But just to make one point, to be fair to the people who would disagree with us, I think the IDF would argue that A, they need to prevent this from ever happening again, which means militarily defeating Hamas. And B, I think they believe that they can militarily have that Entebbe operation that you described, that we all, every morning when we look at our phones, we hope that this is the news coming out. Every time they say, at a special conference by the Dover itself, right, by the press officer of the army, we always hope it's an announcement of a big operation that they've released the hostages. And I think the IDF really believes that they can do it militarily, but we are a lot of
So
us
far,
are.
it hasn't happened. And you know what? You said be fair to those who might disagree. I don't think life is fair, so I don't have to be fair to those who disagree with me. But
It's your podcast.
but
so
we
you can
do,
what
but we
you
do
want.
have to give them a platform. That much I believe in. Give everyone a platform. But anyhow, Nurit, Noah, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for Roger, who was with us earlier, and to all our listeners and viewers. You can find us Mondays and Thursdays here, all your podcast platforms, Google, Apple, Spotify, you name it, YouTube, and at the JPPI website. In the meantime, have a Shabbat Shalom and a nice weekend. We'll see you soon.